Welcome back, everybody, to yet another episode of the Retirement Insights Podcast with Jim Musgrave. I'm your host, James Anderson, and we're joined, as always, by Jim and again by Andy in this part 2 episode of digging into the conversation around the nuances to financial advisors and what the different types of advisors are. We talked about that in our last episode. We kind of talked about how the type of advisor that you choose to work with should depend on ultimately the goal that you're trying to accomplish at that moment. We talked about how a lot of times while we're in our working years, we're trying to build up as much assets and wealth as we can so that we can live in retirement. And then we get to that phase where we start to transition out of the growth or accumulation stage and into the actual retirement stage, where we now need to utilize the money and use it for income, since we no longer have a job to provide that income. And so we talked about as you transition into that, you really need to pick an advisor that will help you accomplish that goal specifically. In today's episode, we're going to dive into some questions and really why you should be asking these questions before you choose to work with any advisor. And so let's dig into it, guys. Let's start asking some of these questions and explain why people should be considering the questions that we're talking about when they go to select who they will work with really for the rest of their life through retirement.
You know, when I was starting to put this together, James, I actually came up with specific questions. And then I was kind of talking to Andy earlier on, and it's like, you know what? I think it's more important to know what you need to know about the advisor. I mean, we can send you questions or no, but anyway, I want to kind of turn this over to Andy a little bit because, you know, he's got so much experience, worked with so many, you know, thousands of different advisors across the country. And I guess the first question that you typically, you know, want people to know about is like, you know, how long you've been in the business. So why is that important, Andy?
Well, obviously, if you're looking to work with someone who's a specialist, you know, you want somebody who has the experience needed to ultimately become a specialist. And I almost liken it to everybody talks about this all the time. But once you get up to 30,000 feet and you're on a cross-country flight, you don't want to find out when you're at 30,000 feet that the person, you know, behind the wheel is a novice and they just landed the job with the airline. You want to know that the person in the cockpit is a 30-year, you know, veteran of piloting a commercial airline and knows exactly what to do in the event that anything goes awry. And so with that experience, obviously comes the wisdom that people need to ultimately help you kind of bring that flight in safely and get you to your destination. And but I'll say this, Jim, if you don't mind, I would just add it's really important from my perspective that when you move from accumulation to income, that you do your due diligence. Like James said, you know, you're talking about a relationship that could last 25 or 30 years. No one wants to get into a relationship with someone from a retirement income perspective only to get divorced from that person or have them pass away or have something terrible happen midway through your retirement. So you want to find yourself working with somebody who's not only equipped to give you the special advice that you need, but also is committed and they have a business plan that's going to remain or allow them and their practice and their firm to remain committed. So this is the biggest financial decision most people ever make in their lives. The more due diligence they do, the more information they have, the greater likelihood they'll make the right decision for them. So that's why we talk about asking these critical questions.
So it's kind of challenging. All right. So if I'm trying to find an advisor, so I mean, I've got over 25 years worth of experience, but that kind of leads to the next question is that, well, when do you intend to retire? Because where am I in my career path? Am I at the beginning, the middle, or the end? And so I think, you know, when do you intend to retire, I think is an important question or something you need to know, which, you know, how long are you going to be around to help me, right? I mean,
Right. Because if you're 65 years old, your spouse is 60 years old, and the person you're talking to says, I intend to retire in 10 years, that's not a deal breaker, but you need to understand what's going to happen and what it's going to mean to you in 10 years before you decide who you're going to hitch your wagon to for the next 25 or 30 years. So, and that leads to the next question, you know, so when do you intend to retire? Somebody says, oh, I'm going to retire in 10 years. I'm going to retire in 15 years. I'm going to retire in 20 years. Well, how old are you now? You know, it's kind of a really in your face kind of question, but you need to know, because if somebody says, well, I'm 65 or 70, we've both seen these folks that are 75 that look 55 and the ones that are 55 that look 75. If they say I'm 75 and I'm going to retire in 20 years, you need to take a step back and ask yourself, right, what other questions do I need to know the answer to before I decide whether or not I'm going to move forward with this person? Because they may have, the energy to work for another 25 years or 20 years, but there are a lot of things that can happen between now and then for somebody who's 75. And that's just the harsh reality that you've got to address up front. Otherwise, you're dealing with it later on the fly when you're well into your own retirement and really not looking forward to going through this process all over again.
Right. And that kind of leads to another question. What you need to know about your advisors is that, well, like, what is your succession plan? Like, how are you, how are you going to, pass the reins to someone else? And, I mean, that's an important thing too. So if I were to retire, or if I were to get hit by a bus today, well, how does that affect you? Or how does that affect the client? I think having a written succession plan is really important. And that's a big deal in our industry. A lot of advisors don't have that, and so, and that's certain things too, is that, I mean, when I was down at the Circle of Wealth conference, there was a speaker up there that this guy had stage 4 cancer, and he basically was working on a business succession plan, for this gentleman, and the widow was there at the conference, and that's real life stuff. I mean, this stuff really happens. So I think having a written succession plan is a really important thing. And Andy, one of the things that you kind of talked about, we were talking about it before going on the air today, is that, so how is an advisor going to sell their practice, right? And so you had a question of, well, will you have any say in who you sell your practice to, right? Why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So again, why does this all come together, right? So if you talk to somebody, the fact that they're 55, 65, that's not a deal breaker, but you need to know, okay, well, what does that mean for me? Do you have a written succession plan? If they don't, obviously you've got to consider that in your own due diligence process, because you don't know what the future holds. You obviously should ask them to put one together if you're thinking about working with them. But beyond that, to your point, Jim, is if they have one, or even if they don't have one, when the time comes for your practice to be moved from the current state it's in to someone else, if you're going to sell it to somebody, if you're going to, have somebody else come in and take it over, am I going to have a say in who that person might be? Because I've seen horror stories where you work with somebody for 10 or 15 years, and then that person decides they're going to sell their practice, and the person they decide to sell it to, well, their current practice is 90 minutes away. So that other advisor is looking to grow their business. They're looking to gather more assets, and they acquire this practice. But now, I'm on the outer fringe of this person's territory. I have to travel 90 minutes if I want to see this person in person, if I want to face off with them in person. And that's a really big change. Now you all of a sudden, here you are, you're saying, well, that doesn't work for me. I need to find a new financial advisor in the midst of me living out my retirement life. And that's a big change. That's a lot. Now all of a sudden you have to take it on. The thing you and I talked about this morning, Jim, in particular, is you may find out 10, 15, 20 years into it, when the real issues start to come into focus, like you mentioned a moment ago, maybe your plan wasn't built to last to begin with. So not only do you need to find somebody new, but you might be looking for somebody to save that plan. And that's a lot to take on for somebody who thought they were going to set it and forget it and retire at 65. So understanding, what that future holds. Am I going to have a say, or am I going to be in a position where I'm not going to have any control? Obviously, if I understand what the succession plan is and I'm going to have the ability to weigh in on it, that's a better situation for me than if I have no control whatsoever.
Right. And so I'm thinking, okay, if just in my example, if I specialize in retirement income planning and I sell my practice to, then obviously I would sell it to another advisor who specializes in what I do. But let's say if I didn't, now my clients would be working with somebody who doesn't specialize in this area. Now, I would never do that, but that it certainly could happen with other people. But I think that's a great point. And another question,
What if you don't match up philosophically, right? What if the person
right?
who takes over has a totally different approach to how they do things?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You got to be on the right philosophical, hemisphere.
I'll go back to what you and I talked about earlier, where at least today, that's probably only about 10% of the financial advisors in the industry today really think like you do, frankly, from my firsthand experience. So that limits the people who you could actually offer your practice to. Now, well, where are they? Are they across the street? Or are they 50 miles away? So there's a lot of things that you want to think about up front, because you don't want to be dealing with the out the I guess the downside of this later.
Hmm. Which kind of brings up, and we've talked about this many times. Are you a generalist or a specialist? And we talked about that in our last podcast about there's many different types of firms and many different types of advisors. And I can tell you what, when you get your licenses and these things, that doesn't make you a specialist. And one of the questions that I have is, well, what kind of continuing education are you doing on an annual basis, and what continuing education? So I've been involved with money tracks in the Circle of Wealth for many years, and I have a certain philosophy on how I approach things. Now, I used to go to the ETF conference down in Hollywood, Florida, which is a big investment conference. But I think the continuing education that advisors go to on an annual basis says a lot about them in terms of the areas that they really want to specialize in. And I guess the other question is that, what makes you a specialist, right? Is it because, I specialize in this?
Right. Self-anointed.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I say so. Yeah.
I'm the king. Okay. Well, what makes you the king? What makes you a specialist, right? So, I think that that's a great point. Do you have special designations? What training have you been through Andy Robertson's Social Security course? What makes you a specialist in this area? I think that's something you need to know about, an advisor. And again, in the retirement income planning space, again, when you get your Series 65 or Series 67, your health and life licenses, again, none of those licenses say one thing about Social Security. And so I think if you're going to be in the retirement income planning space, is that do you have any specific training on Social Security? And again, one reason why I got Andy on this episode is that he literally teaches the course that me and thousands of other advisors across the country had to take to be knowledgeable and certified to teach that particular topic. So I'm sure you have some things to share about Social Security and at that kind of specialized training.
Yeah,
And
as we talked about last time. So think of the way I think about Social Security from a planning perspective is, for a financial advisor, it's really the one last opportunity you have to save what may otherwise be a doomed retirement income plan. Think about it, Jim. You know this firsthand. But if somebody shows up at your office and they're ready to retire, their situation by and large is fully baked. There isn't much you can do to backfill any shortfall they may have in capital. What their income needs may be. You have no control over longevity. Social Security is the one last opportunity you have as a planning tool to deliver a significantly better outcome. You can't write somebody a check to backfill any shortfall they have in capital. You don't have any idea, whether or not the income is going to last for their lifetime. Social Security can change all that. And what we've done through our training and with our software is we've armed the financial advisors that we work with, who are retirement income specialists, with the tools they need to show quantitatively how Social Security can really be the catalyst for building and delivering a better, more fortified plan. And we're able to deliver retirement income plans for, on average, 50% less capital. So to be clear, what does that mean? For somebody who thinks they're way behind in the savings, the retirement savings effort, they may find out that actually they may be in really good shape if they're working with the right person. The specialist is going to be able to show them quantitatively how Social Security could rescue what they thought was an otherwise doomed retirement income plan. And for those high net worth people that I know you have a lot in your market that you work with, they're interested in the same thing. If I can deliver the income I need for half as much capital, why would I ever do anything different? But Social Security is the catalyst for delivering that reduced cost, if you will, lower capital requirement income plan. There is nothing else that you can turn to when your client comes to you on the doorstep of retirement to deliver that kind of an impact. So Social Security really is a catalyst for delivering long-term retirement income security that's not only within budget and fits within the capital you have, but More often than not, it's tax efficient, it's automatically inflation adjusted, and maybe most importantly, it provides a significantly better floor from a survivor benefit perspective. Because as you know, Jim, most people, while they're together, they'll probably be okay. It may not be great, but it'll be okay. The real issues happen when one of them's still here at 85 or 90 and they didn't plan to be. Social Security is a huge factor in delivering financial security to the surviving spouses.
Right. And in a previous episode that we talked about three different distribution strategies. We talked about the probability based approach. We talked about the safety first or flooring approach. We talked about the three bucket strategy. And Andy, what you're just talking about with Social Security is what we call the safety first or flooring approach, where you're ultimately just trying to raise the guaranteed income up. And when you do that, you minimize market risk, you minimize longevity risk. And if you have an income annuity that's paid out over 2 lives, now you're because what happens with Social Security, Andy, as you know, is that spouse A dies, spouse B either gets the greater of theirs or the deceased spouse. So you basically, with married couples, you lose roughly half of the Social Security benefit. So these are certain things that you really have to kind of think about. And which also kind of, another question that you needed, or just things you need to know about the advisor is that, what licenses do you have? Now, to become a financial advisor, you have to be securities licensed to give advice. Again, you can look this up on Google, but there's the Series 63, the 65, and then a combination of those two is the 66, which is basically that you are licensed to actually charge a fee for advice and or to manage money. Then you also have the Series 7, which is your stockbroker's license. And most well-rounded advisors are going to have their health and life licenses, so they can sell life insurance, long-term care, maybe health insurance, disability, those sorts of things, and annuities. So I think those licenses are important. I know a lot of advisors that don't have a securities license. They actually have an insurance license. And we're going to kind of talk about that in the next episode in terms of fiduciaries and labels and kind of things like that. But I think just for the the listening public out there, understanding the licenses that the advisor has is important. And one way you can do that is that you can look up broker check on finra.org. If you go to my website, jimmusgrave.com, at the very bottom of the homepage, there's a little icon called broker check. And you can look up any broker who is licensed and see their history, if they have any complaints, all that kind of stuff. So I think the licenses are important. And again, finally, we've been talking about specialists and trying to find the person that makes sense to work with you. But what designations do you have? We talked about that in our last episode. Having somebody with a professional designation like a CFP, CHFC, CRPC, those sorts of things, really give you an idea of the credentials of the advisor that you're working with. There are many more questions that you can ask, but again, in this episode, we were just trying to give people an idea of really what you need to know about the advisor. We could go on for another hour, but I don't think you guys want to hear that. Were there any last thoughts that you had, James or Andy, kind of on this topic of really what you need to know about your advisor before you hire them?
Well, I'll just say, as I've said in the prior episode, it really comes down to the philosophy, right? So, I think designations and licenses and all those things are kind of table stakes items, if you will. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to figure out who you want to work with when it comes to delivering retirement income, you have to have as much knowledge as possible about that person so you can discern whether or not they're really a specialist and they're focused on the same things that you are. Obviously, you don't want to find out 10 years into it that they're really a generalist masquerading as a specialist. Specialists can answer these questions. They can lay out for you definitively how they do it, who they do it with, when they do it, why they do it. And that is the key to putting yourself in a position where you don't wake up 10 or 15 or 20 years into retirement and having to start the most important financial decision you'll ever make in your life, have to do it all over again. So I think focus on philosophy. That's what you want to get to. And if they can lay it out for you and show you, you know, empirical evidence, for lack of a better term, that they're truly specialists, then I think you're heading in the right direction. It's always a relationship in the financial services industry. You want to work with somebody you feel like you can trust. Well, that's obviously, again, that's step one. But step two is, are they really who they say they are? Do they have the track record, the expertise, the experience? Do they embrace the philosophically the tools and all the things that are needed for them to give you what you need over the next 25 or 30 years?
I
Yeah.
think that's a great point, Andy. And I think you set up our next two podcast topics very well, because in our next podcast, we're actually going to talk about fiduciaries, and that I think that's a really important topic. I think there's some misconceptions about fiduciaries, and then we're also in the episode after that, we're going to talk about why it's important to work with a specialist. So I think you set that up perfectly. And again, those are going to be the next topics, so you definitely want to tune in for those. And did you have any other thoughts, James? On this episode here.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you guys have been talking about. I think about this, a neighbor of mine that had a life-altering experience. He had a mini stroke, and miraculously, he has recovered to a certain degree, but certain functionality. I mean, he was a professor at a university, and because of the stroke, he's not able to work in the same capacity. His mind, he's lost a little bit of that functionality. And so some of the tasks of being a professor are difficult for him. And now they're having to face prematurely, some of these types of things and what they're going to do and how they're going to live out the rest of their life if he can't ever work again and if she has to go back to work or whatever. And I mean, it's easy to say, ask these questions, but the reality is you really do need to consider the scenarios that you are in personally and individually. And so I hope that the listeners have found some value in these questions, because they are important. They're not end all be alls, but they should help give you a guide to get you in front of the best possible choice for you to help you take you through retirement. The last thing I'll say is, if there is any listener that has any questions, they're not quite sure, feel free to go to jimmusgrave.com, set up a time, meet with Jim, ask these questions to him, and get a scenario for you that you can have an idea of whether your plan is set up to take care of you through whatever the potential scenarios will come through retirement. And so we invite you to go there. Also, if you found this episode helpful, subscribe. We'd love to get more subscribers on this episode, as we'll be delivering more value. With that, let's end by just saying this next episode, you guys really will not want to miss out. You want to listen to this next episode, where we're going to dive into the mysterious myth of what does it mean to be a fiduciary? And can somebody truly be trusted simply because they have the designation of fiduciary? We'll dive into all of it. We'll dissect it all and provide you guys some wonderful insights there. So until then, tune in on our next episode. Thank you for joining us.